You're nothing but a burden, Mom. I wish you'd just disappear and let me live my life. Those words hit me like ice water on Christmas morning, spoken by the son I had sacrificed everything for. He thought he was so independent, so self-made, but what he didn't know was that every bill in his apartment, every comfort in his life, every safety net beneath his feet, it all had my name on it. And when the time came to cut those strings, he would learn exactly what carrying a real burden felt like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lourdes Smith, and I'm 58 years old. That Christmas morning when everything changed, I was standing in my kitchen in Riverside, California, wearing the red apron my late husband Marcus had bought me years ago. It had little embroidered holly leaves around the edges, and every December I pulled it out of the drawer like a treasured ritual. The house smelled of cinnamon rolls rising in the oven and fresh coffee brewing, the same Christmas morning tradition I'd maintained for 26 years, even after Marcus passed. The morning had started like any other Christmas in the Smith household. I'd been up since 5 a.m., preparing the feast that would feed not just my son Daniel and his girlfriend Rebecca, but also my daughter Maria, who was driving down from Sacramento with her 2 kids. The dining room table was set with my grandmother's china, the good crystal glasses that only came out twice a year, and the silver candlesticks that Marcus had given me on our first Christmas as newlyweds. I remember feeling particularly grateful that morning. Daniel, my 28-year-old son, had finally seemed to be getting his life together. After years of bouncing between jobs, failed business ventures, and what he called finding himself, he'd landed a position at a marketing firm 6 months earlier. He'd moved into a nice apartment in downtown Riverside, started dating Rebecca, who seemed like a sweet girl, and for the first time in years, our Christmas conversations didn't revolve around his latest crisis or financial emergency. What I didn't realize was that his newfound stability was entirely an illusion, one that I had been unknowingly funding. Daniel arrived at 11 a.m. sharp, Rebecca trailing behind him carrying a small gift bag. He looked good, better than he had in months. His hair was freshly cut, he was wearing a expensive-looking sweater I didn't recognize, and he carried himself with a confidence that should have made me proud. Instead, looking back, I realize it should have made me suspicious. "Morning, Mom," he said, giving me the kind of quick, obligatory hug that had replaced the warm embraces of his childhood. Rebecca smiled politely and handed me the gift bag, bath salts from Target, still with the price tag showing $12.99. I thanked her genuinely, because I'd learned long ago that the size of the gift mattered less than the thought behind it. We settled into the living room with coffee and the cinnamon rolls. The tree stood in the corner, decorated with the same mismatched ornaments we'd collected over the years. Handmade clay angels from Daniel and Maria's elementary school years, delicate glass balls that had survived multiple moves, and the slightly crooked star on top that Marcus had insisted on using every year because it has character. The conversation started pleasantly enough. Daniel talked about his job, describing projects and deadlines with the enthusiasm of someone who was genuinely engaged with their work. Rebecca chimed in occasionally, sharing stories about her nursing program at UC Riverside. I felt that warm maternal satisfaction of watching my children build lives I could be proud of. But then Maria called to say she was running late. One of the kids had come down with a stomach bug, and they needed to stop frequently on the drive down. I suggested we push dinner back an hour, which seemed reasonable to everyone. That's when the mood began to shift. Daniel's phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the morning, but he'd been ignoring it. Finally, during a lull in conversation, he pulled it out to check his messages. I watched his face change as he scrolled through what appeared to be a long list of notifications. His jaw tightened, his shoulders tensed, and he began typing furiously with his thumbs. "Everything okay, honey?" I asked, the way mothers do when they sense their child's distress. "It's fine," he said without looking up, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Just some bills and stuff. Nothing important." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably on the couch beside him. I caught her glancing at the screen of his phone, and something in her expression, a flicker of concern, maybe even embarrassment, made me pay closer attention. Daniel continued scrolling and typing, his mood growing darker by the minute. Finally, he shoved the phone into his pocket with more force than necessary and stood up abruptly. "I need some air," he announced, heading toward the back patio, without waiting for a response. Through the sliding glass door, I could see him pacing back and forth across the small deck, his phone pressed to his ear. His free hand gestured animatedly as he spoke, and even though I couldn't hear the words, his body language screamed frustration and stress. Rebecca and I sat in awkward silence for a few minutes before she finally spoke up. "He's been really stressed lately," she said quietly, as if Daniel might hear her through the glass. "The apartment, the car payment, all the expenses of starting over in a new place. It's been challenging." Something in the way she said challenging made my maternal instincts prickle. I'd been supporting Daniel financially for so long that it had become as automatic as breathing. Even after he'd gotten this new job, even after he'd moved into his own place and started talking about independence, the requests for help had continued. A few hundred here for utilities, 1,000 there for car repairs, emergency loans for this or that unexpected expense. I'd always told myself it was temporary, that I was just helping him get established. Marcus and I had planned well for retirement. And after he passed, the life insurance and his pension had left me comfortable enough to help my children when they needed it. It felt like the right thing to do, the loving thing to do. I was investing in their futures, giving them the foundation they needed to build successful, independent lives. But sitting there on Christmas morning, watching my son pace angrily on the patio, while his girlfriend made nervous small talk about his financial stress, I began to wonder if I'd been enabling rather than helping. Daniel came back inside 20 minutes later, his face flushed and his mood visibly darker. He slumped back onto the couch without explanation, grabbed his coffee mug, and drained it in one long gulp. "Who was that?" I asked gently. "Landlord," he said curtly. "Some issue with the rent payment. Nothing I can't handle." But Rebecca's expression suggested otherwise. She looked worried, almost scared, like someone who'd been watching a problem grow larger and more unmanageable over time. The rest of the morning passed with a tension that hadn't been there before. Daniel's responses became shorter, more clipped. He checked his phone obsessively, his face growing more troubled with each notification. When I suggested we start preparing Christmas dinner, he barely responded. It was while I was in the kitchen, pulling the turkey from the oven, that I heard it. Daniel's voice rising from the living room, sharp with frustration and anger. I couldn't make out all the words, but the tone was unmistakable. He was arguing with someone on the phone, his voice carrying the kind of desperate edge that comes from feeling cornered. I paused, oven mitts still on my hands, listening to my son's distress and feeling that familiar maternal pull to fix whatever was wrong. It was the same instinct that had led me to send him money dozens of times before, the same impulse that had made me cover his rent deposits and car payments and credit card bills without question. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the way Rebecca had described his stress as if it were a chronic condition rather than a temporary setback. Maybe it was the realization that despite months of steady employment, Daniel seemed more financially unstable than ever. Or maybe it was simply the accumulation of years of watching my capable, intelligent son remain perpetually dependent on my support. When he finally ended the call and came into the kitchen, his face was flushed with anger, and something that looked almost like panic. "Mom," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "I need to ask you something." And that's when everything began to unravel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Daniel stood in my kitchen doorway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking like the scared little boy he used to be when he'd broken something valuable and had to confess. But this wasn't about a broken vase or a scraped knee. This was about money. And from the tremor in his voice, it was about a lot of money. "I need $5,000, he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The landlord is threatening eviction, my car got repossessed this morning, and my credit cards are maxed out. Everything is falling apart, and I don't know what else to do." I set down the oven mitt slowly, my mind racing to process what he'd just told me. Repossessed car? Eviction threats? How had things gotten this bad when he'd been working steadily for 6 months? "Daniel, slow down," I said, moving to the kitchen table and gesturing for him to sit. "Tell me what's really going on." That's when the whole story came pouring out, the real story I'd never heard before. the marketing job he'd been so proud of? It was commission-based with a tiny base salary. Most months, he barely made enough to cover his basic expenses. The nice apartment in downtown Riverside? He'd lied about the rent on the application and had been scrambling to make up the difference ever since. The confident, put-together version of himself he'd been presenting? It was all a facade built on credit cards and borrowed time. "I thought I could make it work," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought the job would pan out, that I'd start earning real money and could pay everything back. But it's been 6 months, and I'm drowning. The only reason I haven't been evicted already is because I've been using cash advances from credit cards to pay rent." As he spoke, I found myself remembering another Christmas morning, 28 years earlier, when I'd held him as a newborn in this same kitchen. Marcus had been making coffee, still in his pajamas, marveling at the fact that we'd brought this tiny, perfect person into the world. I'd looked down at Daniel's sleeping face and made silent promises about the life I would give him, the opportunities I would create, the security I would provide. Marcus and I had both grown up poor. He'd worked construction his entire life, starting as a laborer and eventually building his own small contracting business. I'd put myself through community college while working nights at a diner, eventually landing a job as a bookkeeper for a local medical practice. We'd saved every penny, made sacrifices others might have called extreme, all so our children could have the chances we never did. When Daniel was born, followed 3 years later by Maria, we doubled down on those efforts. We lived in a modest house when we could have afforded better, drove used cars long past their prime, and rarely took vacations. Every financial decision was filtered through one question: how will this impact our children's futures? I'd started Daniel's college fund when he was 6 months old, adding to it religiously every month. By the time he graduated high school, there was enough to cover 4 years at any state university, plus living expenses. I remember the pride I felt watching him open that acceptance letter to UC San Diego, knowing that unlike me, he wouldn't have to work through school or graduate with crushing debt. But Daniel had struggled in college from the beginning. The freedom overwhelmed him, and his grades suffered. After 2 years of academic probation and failed attempts at different majors, he dropped out, insisting he needed to find himself before committing to a degree he wasn't passionate about. I'd supported that decision. Marcus had been less understanding, but I'd convinced him that forcing Daniel into something he wasn't ready for would only lead to resentment and failure. We'd given him space to figure things out, continuing to provide financial support while he explored different paths. That exploration had lasted 6 years. There had been the photography phase, when he'd convinced us to loan him $3,000 for professional equipment. Then the fitness instructor certification that required another $2,000 for training and materials. After that came the food truck idea, a $10,000 investment that lasted exactly 4 months before Daniel decided the restaurant industry wasn't for him. Each time he'd approached us with genuine enthusiasm and what seemed like solid plans. Each time I'd found myself reaching for my checkbook, unable to bear the thought of my child's dreams dying for lack of financial support. Marcus had grown increasingly skeptical, but he'd never said no either. We were parents after all. Wasn't this what parents did? When Marcus died suddenly of a heart attack 3 years ago, I'd inherited not just his life insurance and pension, but also the full responsibility of supporting Daniel's endless string of new beginnings. Without Marcus's voice of caution to balance my maternal instincts, I'd become even more generous with financial assistance. The marketing job had seemed different, though. For the first time in years, Daniel had approached me not asking for money to start something new, but proudly announcing that he'd found steady employment. He described the salary and benefits package with such confidence that I'd actually felt relief. Finally, my son was becoming self-sufficient. What I hadn't realized was that even with steady employment, the pattern of financial dependence hadn't changed. It had just become more subtle, more disguised as temporary emergencies rather than startup investments. Looking at Daniel now, sitting at my kitchen table with his head in his hands, I began to add up the true cost of my parental generosity over the years. The college fund that had been spent on 2 years of poor grades, the photography equipment gathering dust in my garage, the fitness certification he'd never used, the food truck that had been sold at a loss, the countless emergency loans for rent, car repairs, medical bills, and credit card payments. Conservative estimate? I'd given Daniel close to $70,000 over the past decade, not counting the everyday expenses I'd covered when he was living at home between ventures. Mom, I know I've asked for help before, Daniel continued, seemingly unaware of my mental calculations. But this is different. This is really an emergency. If I don't come up with this money by January 1st, I'll be homeless. And if I'm homeless, I'll lose the job and then I'll never be able to pay you back. The promise to pay me back was one I'd heard many times before. In the early days, Daniel had actually made token payments toward his debts to us. $20 here, $50 there, accompanied by apologies and renewed promises to do better. But as the amounts had grown larger and his financial situation had remained precarious, even those token payments had stopped. I'd told myself it didn't matter. The money was a gift, an investment in his future, a way of honoring the promises I'd made to that sleeping newborn all those years ago. What kind of mother kept score of help given to her own child? But sitting there on Christmas morning, watching Daniel's latest crisis unfold, I realized that my generosity hadn't created the security and opportunity I'd intended. Instead, it had created something else entirely. A grown man who was completely unprepared to handle the basic responsibilities of adult life. Every time I'd swooped in to solve his problems with money, I'd robbed him of the chance to develop his own problem-solving skills. Every crisis I'd prevented had been a lesson he'd never learned. Every safety net I'd provided had made him less careful about where he stepped. Daniel, I said carefully, help me understand something. You've been working for 6 months. Where has your paycheck been going if not to rent and car payments? He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, there are a lot of expenses you don't think about when you're living with your parents. Groceries, utilities, insurance, work clothes, gas money. And Rebecca and I have been going out a lot, trying to build a normal relationship. Dinners, movies, weekend trips. Plus, I had to furnish the apartment when I moved in, and that wasn't cheap. As he listed his expenses, I felt something shift inside me. These weren't emergencies or unexpected catastrophes. These were the basic costs of being an adult, costs that every working person had to manage within their means. Daniel had simply decided that his means should include unlimited access to my bank account. And you never thought to budget for these things? I asked. I tried, but the numbers just don't work, he said defensively. Do you know how expensive it is to live on your own these days? Between rent and car payments and everything else, there's nothing left over. What struck me wasn't just his financial irresponsibility, but his complete lack of awareness about it. In Daniel's mind, the problem wasn't his spending choices or his failure to live within his means. The problem was that life was expensive and his mother wasn't giving him enough money to live the lifestyle he wanted. I thought about Maria, who had also received help from Marcus and me, but who had used that support to build genuine independence. She'd taken our contribution to her education and turned it into a nursing degree. She'd borrowed money for a house down payment and paid us back within 2 years. When she'd needed help with childcare, she'd asked for our time, not our money, and had always been grateful for what she received. The difference wasn't in their circumstances or opportunities. The difference was in how they'd learned to view support from others, as a temporary boost toward independence, or as a permanent entitlement. Standing there in my kitchen, watching my 28-year-old son expect me to solve yet another crisis of his own making, I realized that my years of loving generosity had created something I'd never intended. A financial dependent who saw my support not as generosity, but as obligation. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I looked at Daniel sitting across from me at the kitchen table, and for the first time in years, I didn't immediately reach for my purse. Something had fundamentally shifted in those few minutes of listening to him explain his latest crisis. Instead of my usual maternal instinct to fix and rescue, I felt something else entirely. Exhaustion. Daniel, I said slowly, I need some time to think about this. His face changed instantly. The expectant, hopeful expression I'd seen so many times before hardened into something I didn't recognize. Think about what? Mom, this is an emergency. I don't have time for you to think about it. The entitlement in his voice hit me like a slap. When had my help stopped being appreciated and started being demanded? When had I become the backup plan for every poor decision he made? I understand you're in a difficult situation, I replied, keeping my voice steady. But $5,000 isn't pocket change, and this isn't the first time we've had this conversation. That's not fair, he said, his voice rising. I've paid you back before. I almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement. Daniel, you've given me maybe $300 total over the past 3 years. That's not paying me back. That's making token gestures. Rebecca, who had been sitting quietly in the living room, appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked uncomfortable, like someone who'd walked into the middle of a family argument and didn't know whether to stay or leave. Maybe I should go, she said quietly. No, stay, Daniel said firmly. This concerns you too. If we can't get this money, we're both going to be homeless. The way he said we made my stomach turn. He'd already decided that his crisis was Rebecca's crisis, just like he'd always assumed his crises were my crises. The pattern was repeating itself with a new generation. I excused myself to check on the turkey, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. As I basted the bird and adjusted the temperature, I could hear Daniel and Rebecca whispering urgently in the dining room. Their voices carried just enough for me to catch fragments. Stubborn, doesn't understand. Find another way. Another way. The phrase stuck with me as I stood there, surrounded by the smells and sounds of Christmas dinner preparation. In all the years I'd been supporting Daniel, had he ever seriously looked for another way? Had he ever exhausted all other options before coming to me with his hand out? The answer was clearly no. I had trained him to see me as the path of least resistance, the solution that required no creativity, no sacrifice, no growth on his part. Why would he look for another way when Mom's way was always available? Maria called while I was mashing potatoes, her voice bright and cheerful despite the delay. Hey Mom, we're about an hour out. Tyler's feeling better, and we stopped for some Dramamine just in case. How's everything going there? I glanced toward the dining room where Daniel and Rebecca were still huddled in intense conversation. It's been interesting, I said. Oh. What's Danny done now? The casual way she said it, what's Danny done now? Struck me as telling. Even Maria, who lived 3 hours away and only saw her brother a few times a year, automatically assumed that interesting meant Daniel was in some kind of trouble. Just some financial issues, I said, not wanting to get into details while he was in the next room. Maria was quiet for a moment. Mom, can I ask you something? And please don't get mad at me for saying this. Of course, honey. When are you going to stop bailing him out? The directness of the question caught me off guard. What do you mean? I mean, every time I talk to you, Danny's having some crisis that you're solving with your checkbook. And I love my brother, I really do, but he's never going to figure out how to take care of himself if you keep taking care of everything for him. I knew she was right, but hearing it from my daughter, my responsible, independent daughter who had never asked me to solve her adult problems, made it hit differently. He's going through a rough patch, I said, the automatic defense of a mother protecting her child. Mom, he's been going through a rough patch for 10 years. At some point, rough patch becomes lifestyle choice. After I hung up with Maria, I stood in my kitchen listening to the low murmur of Daniel and Rebecca's conversation. They weren't discussing solutions or alternatives. They were strategizing about how to convince me to give them the money. The realization made me feel sick. I thought about Marcus and how he would have handled this situation. He'd always been more skeptical of Daniel's requests for help, more likely to ask hard questions about accountability and consequences. Lourdes, he'd said after the food truck failure, we're not helping him by making everything easy. Sometimes people need to feel the weight of their choices. I had argued with him then, accused him of being too hard on our son, but sitting there surrounded by the evidence of yet another crisis that Daniel expected me to solve, I wondered if Marcus had seen something I'd been too blinded by maternal love to recognize. When I returned to the dining room, Daniel and Rebecca had moved apart, trying to look casual. But the tension was still thick in the air, and Daniel's jaw was set in that stubborn way I remembered from his teenage years. So, he said, trying to sound nonchalant, have you thought about it? I've thought about a lot of things, I replied, sitting down across from them. Tell me something, Daniel. What would you do if I wasn't here? If you didn't have me to ask for money? He looked genuinely puzzled by the question. What do you mean? I mean, if I didn't exist, if you couldn't call me for help, how would you handle this situation? That's a weird question, Mom, but you are here, and you can help, so why are we talking about hypotheticals? The casual dismissal in his voice was the final straw. He wasn't even willing to consider the possibility of solving his own problems. In his mind, my resources were his resources, and any reluctance on my part to share them was selfishness, rather than an attempt to help him grow. Because, I said carefully, I'm starting to think that always being here to help might actually be hurting you. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Daniel's face darkened. That's ridiculous, he said. Helping your kids is what parents do. That's what family means. Family means a lot of things, Daniel. It means love and support and being there for each other. But it doesn't mean one person carries all the responsibility while everyone else gets to make poor choices without consequences. Poor choices? His voice was getting louder now. Mom, I'm working. I'm trying. It's not my fault that everything is so expensive, or that my job doesn't pay enough, or that life is harder than it used to be. Everything he said was technically true, but it was also completely beside the point. Yes, life was expensive. Yes, starting out as an adult was challenging, but millions of people managed to do it without expecting their parents to subsidize their lifestyle indefinitely. You're right, I said. Life is hard and expensive. That's exactly why people have to learn to budget, to live within their means, to make difficult choices about what they can and can't afford. I do budget, he protested. Daniel, if you budgeted, you wouldn't be facing eviction and repossession. You'd be living in a place you could afford, driving a car whose payments fit your income, and building an emergency fund for unexpected expenses. It's not that simple. It absolutely is that simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car in the driveway. Maria had arrived with the kids, and I could hear their excited voices as they tumbled out of the minivan. In a few minutes, my house would be filled with the chaos and joy of Christmas with grandchildren, and this tense conversation would have to be set aside. But as I watched Daniel's face harden with resentment, I realized that something had fundamentally changed between us in the space of that conversation. For the first time in his adult life, I had questioned his assumptions about my willingness to rescue him. I had suggested that his problems might be the result of his choices, rather than just bad luck or external circumstances. And he clearly didn't like it. As we got up to greet Maria and the kids, Daniel leaned close to me and said quietly, "We'll talk about this later, when there aren't so many people around." There was something in his tone that made me pause. Not pleading or desperate, but demanding. As if my hesitation to immediately hand over $5,000 was an inconvenience that needed to be managed, rather than a reasonable response that deserved consideration. I smiled and nodded, but inside I was already beginning to understand that this conversation was about much more than Christmas morning financial crisis. It was about the fundamental relationship between us, about respect and responsibility, and what I owed my adult child versus what he owed himself. And for the first time in Daniel's 28 years, I wasn't sure the answer favored him. Christmas dinner was a masterclass in forced normalcy. Maria's kids, 8-year-old Tyler and 5-year-old Sophia, filled the house with their infectious energy, bouncing between the living room where their new toys lay scattered and the kitchen where I was frantically trying to coordinate the final preparations. Their laughter should have been the soundtrack to a perfect family Christmas, but underneath it all, I could feel the tension radiating from Daniel like heat from a furnace. He played his part well, I had to give him credit for that. He helped carry dishes to the table, complimented the turkey, and made appropriate small talk with Maria about her job at Sacramento General Hospital. But I caught the way his eyes kept flicking to his phone, the tight set of his shoulders, the forced quality of his smile. Rebecca seemed to be walking on eggshells, jumping in to fill any silence that lasted too long. It was during dessert that Maria picked up on the undercurrent of tension. "Everything okay, Danny?" she asked, spooning homemade apple pie onto Sophia's plate. "You seem a little stressed." Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Just work stuff, he said dismissively. You know how it is. But Maria had always been perceptive, even as a child. She tilted her head slightly, studying her brother with the same analytical gaze she probably used to assess patients in the ER. Work stuff on Christmas? She pressed gently. That sounds rough. It's nothing I can't handle, Daniel said, but there was an edge to his voice that made Tyler look up from his pie with curious eyes. I found myself watching this exchange with a strange detachment, as if I were observing someone else's family. For years, I would have jumped in to smooth over any hint of conflict, to protect Daniel from uncomfortable questions or redirect the conversation to safer topics. But today, I remained silent, curious to see how he would handle Maria's gentle probing without my intervention. The evening continued with the usual Christmas traditions. We moved to the living room where the kids opened their remaining presents, while the adults sipped coffee and watched their excitement. Maria had brought photo albums from Tyler's soccer season, and we passed them around, making the appropriate sounds of admiration and pride. But throughout it all, Daniel's phone continued to buzz. Each notification seemed to darken his mood further, and by the time we were cleaning up the dessert plates, he was practically vibrating with barely contained anxiety. Mom, he said quietly as we found ourselves alone in the kitchen, we really need to finish our conversation. Daniel, it's Christmas. Your sister and the kids are here. Can't this wait until tomorrow? No, it can't wait. His voice was sharp enough that Maria looked over from the living room where she was helping Sophia put together a new puzzle. Some things are more important than playing happy family. The casual cruelty of that statement, dismissing his sister's visit and his nephew's presence as merely playing happy family, revealed more about his state of mind than any desperate plea could have. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about Daniel's growing resentment toward anyone and anything that stood between him and what he wanted. What's going on? Maria asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway with that concerned big sister expression I remembered from their childhood. Nothing, Daniel said quickly, but the damage was done. Maria's nursing instincts had kicked in, and she could sense crisis as clearly as if someone had taken a patient's blood pressure and found it dangerously elevated. Daniel, I said firmly, if this can't wait, then let's step outside and discuss it privately. We moved to the back patio, leaving Rebecca to help Maria with the kids. The December air was sharp and cold, raising goosebumps on my arms despite the cardigan I'd thrown over my dress. Daniel paced back and forth across the small space like a caged animal, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Okay, I said, crossing my arms against the cold. You have my full attention. What exactly is so urgent that it couldn't wait until after Christmas? Everything, he said, spinning to face me. Mom, I wasn't kidding about the timeline. If I don't have that money by January 1st, I'm out on the street. And it's not just me. It's Rebecca, too. Do you want that on your conscience? The attempt to make me responsible for Rebecca's housing situation was a new low, even for Daniel. Rebecca has family, Daniel. And more importantly, Rebecca has a job and her own income. If your relationship puts her at risk of homelessness, maybe she needs to reconsider the relationship, not assume I'll subsidize it. His face flushed red, whether from the cold or anger I couldn't tell. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Daniel, you're asking me for $5,000 to solve problems that you created with poor financial planning. You're acting like this is my emergency when it's entirely yours. I'm your son, he shouted, loud enough that I worried the neighbors might hear. I'm your child and I'm asking for help. You're 28 years old, I replied, keeping my voice level despite the rage I could see building in his eyes. You're not a child. You haven't been a child for a long time. And the fact that you keep asking for help instead of figuring out how to help yourself is exactly the problem. So what? You're just gonna let me be homeless? You're gonna let your son live on the street because you want to teach me some kind of lesson? The melodrama in his voice, the way he painted this as a choice between cruelty and compassion, was so manipulative that I felt my own anger beginning to rise. Daniel, stop. Just stop with the emotional manipulation. You're not going to be homeless because I won't give you money. You're going to be homeless because you chose to rent an apartment you couldn't afford, lease a car beyond your means, and spend money on entertainment instead of saving for emergencies. That's not fair. Life isn't fair. That's one of the first lessons adults have to learn. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him recalibrating, trying to figure out what approach might work when guilt and manipulation had failed. Fine, he said finally. How about this? Loan me the money, write up a contract, charge me interest, whatever you want. I'll pay you back with interest. I almost laughed at the suggestion. Daniel, you currently owe me approximately $15,000 from previous loans that you've made no effort to repay. Why would I believe this time would be different? Because this time will be different. I've learned my lesson. Have you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the only lesson you've learned is to ask for larger amounts. The conversation was interrupted by Sophia's voice calling from inside the house. Grandma, Uncle Danny, come see my puzzle. The innocent joy in her voice was such a stark contrast to the ugly conversation happening on the patio that I felt almost dizzy from the whiplash. Here was a 5-year-old who was genuinely excited about a simple jigsaw puzzle, while her 28-year-old uncle was having a meltdown because his mother wouldn't hand him $5,000 to fix problems he'd created. We should go back inside, I said. Mom, we're not done talking. Yes, we are. For tonight, anyway. This is unbelievable, he muttered, but he followed me back into the warm house where Maria was helping Tyler set up a new board game while Rebecca sat on the couch looking miserable. The rest of the evening passed in stilted conversation and forced cheer. Daniel barely spoke, responding to direct questions with monosyllables and spending most of his time staring at his phone. When Maria announced that they needed to head back to Sacramento, it was a school night for Tyler, and she had an early shift at the hospital. Daniel and Rebecca left with them, claiming they had early plans the next day. But as they were putting on their coats, Daniel leaned close to me one more time. I hope you sleep well tonight, he said quietly, knowing that your son is about to lose everything because you're too selfish to help. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because of the venom with which they were delivered. This wasn't my loving son asking for help in a moment of crisis. This was a man who felt entitled to my money and was angry that I wasn't complying with his demands. After everyone left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the detritus of Christmas dinner, wrapping paper, empty coffee cups, children's toys scattered across the carpet. The house felt impossibly quiet after the chaos of the day, and for the first time, I allowed myself to really process what had just happened. My son had called me selfish for refusing to give him $5,000 to cover expenses he should have been managing himself. He had tried to make me responsible for his girlfriend's housing situation. He had attempted emotional manipulation, guilt trips, and when those failed had resorted to name-calling and cruelty. And the most disturbing part? None of it seemed calculated or strategic. This wasn't Daniel putting on an act to get money. This was Daniel genuinely believing that I owed him whatever he asked for, and that any reluctance on my part was a betrayal of our relationship. I thought about Maria's earlier question, when are you going to stop bailing him out? The answer, I realized, was now. Not because I didn't love Daniel, but because I loved him too much to keep enabling his complete inability to function as an independent adult. The question was, what was I prepared to do about it? The morning after Christmas dawned gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. I woke before sunrise, something that had become a habit since Marcus died, and made my way to the kitchen in my robe and slippers. The house still smelled faintly of yesterday's feast, turkey and cinnamon, coffee and pine from the Christmas tree, but instead of comforting me, those scents felt like ghosts of a celebration that had gone terribly wrong. I made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table where Daniel had demanded $5,000 less than 24 hours earlier. In the harsh light of morning, our confrontation felt even more surreal. Had my son really called me selfish for refusing to fund his irresponsible lifestyle? Had he really tried to make me feel guilty about his girlfriend's potential homelessness? My phone buzzed with a text message. Daniel, of course. Mom, I'm sorry about last night. I was stressed and said things I didn't mean. Can we talk today? This situation is really urgent. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. The apology felt hollow. Sorry for his tone, perhaps, but not for his expectations or demands. And the immediate pivot back to his urgent situation confirmed that he viewed his behavior as a minor tactical error rather than a fundamental problem. "I need some time to think, Daniel. I'll call you in a few days." His response came back within minutes. "A few days? Mom, I don't have a few days. Please." I turned off my phone. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since Marcus died. I made a list. Not a grocery list or a to-do list, but a comprehensive accounting of every dollar I'd given Daniel over the past 10 years. I pulled out bank statements, old checkbooks, credit card records, anything that might help me reconstruct the full scope of my financial support. What I discovered was staggering. The college fund that had covered 2 years of poor grades and eventual dropout, $28,000. The photography equipment loan, $3,200. The fitness certification, $2,100. The food truck investment, $10,500. The emergency car repair that turned out to be a down payment on a newer, more expensive vehicle, $4,800. Monthly rent assistance during his various periods of unemployment, roughly $15,000 over 3 years. Credit card debt I'd paid off twice, $8,400. The security deposit and first month's rent for his current apartment, $3,500. Miscellaneous loans for everything from dental work to new clothes for job interviews, another $6,000. The total came to $81,500. I sat back in my chair, staring at the number I'd written at the bottom of the page. $81,500. More than Marcus had made in his best year as a contractor. More than I'd spent on my car, my house repairs, and my own living expenses combined over the past 3 years. And Daniel's response to this massive investment in his future? Calling me selfish for hesitating to add another $5,000 DAC to the pile. That evening, I called my financial advisor, Robert Chen, whom Marcus and I had worked with for 15 years. Robert had helped us plan for retirement, guided us through the process of setting up college funds for the kids, and managed Marcus's life insurance policies after his death. "Lourdes, good to hear from you," Robert said warmly. "How was your Christmas?" "Educational," I replied dryly. "Robert, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. If I continue supporting Daniel financially at the current rate, what does that mean for my own financial security?" There was a pause. "Can you give me some specifics about the support you're providing?" I read him my list. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Robert, are you there?" "I'm here," he said slowly. "Lourdes, I had no idea the amounts were this substantial. At this rate of expenditure, you're looking at significant impacts to your retirement security. If you continue spending at this level for another 5 to 10 years, how significant? You could be looking at having to sell your house, drastically reduce your standard of living, or potentially exhaust your savings entirely before you reach 80. The bluntness of his assessment hit me like a bucket of cold water. I'd been so focused on helping Daniel that I'd never considered the long-term consequences to my own stability. What kind of mother would I be if I ended up destitute and dependent on my children in my old age? "Robert, I need you to do something for me. I want you to set up a separate account that I can't access easily. Something that requires advance notice, and maybe even your approval to withdraw from." "Lourdes, that's a very smart move. How much were you thinking of protecting?" I thought about Daniel's latest demand and all the future demands that would inevitably follow. Enough to ensure that I can age with dignity, regardless of what financial emergencies my children might have. After I hung up with Robert, I spent the evening researching something I'd never thought I'd need to know about: enabling behavior and financial boundaries with adult children. What I found was both validating and heartbreaking. Story after story of parents who had destroyed their own financial security trying to rescue adult children who never learned to rescue themselves. I read about the difference between helping and enabling, about how financial support without accountability often created dependency rather than independence. I learned about tough love and natural consequences, concepts that felt foreign and cruel when applied to my own child, but made logical sense when I considered the bigger picture. One article particularly resonated with me. It was written by a mother whose 40-year-old son had drained her retirement account with a series of emergency loans that were never repaid. She'd ended up having to move in with her daughter, selling the family home to survive. The son, meanwhile, had simply moved on to borrowing from his siblings, his ex-wife, and anyone else who would enable his financial irresponsibility. The hardest lesson I learned, she wrote, was that my love was not helping him. It was hurting both of us. Real love sometimes means letting people experience the consequences of their choices, even when those consequences are painful to watch. The next morning, I called Maria. "Hey Mom, how are you feeling after yesterday? Danny seemed pretty upset when they left." "Maria, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Has Daniel ever asked you for money?" "Mom," she sighed, "yes, several times. But I've always said no." "Why?" "Because he makes more money than I do, but he's always broke. Because every time he gets into financial trouble he calls you instead of figuring it out himself. Because I have 2 kids and a mortgage, and I can't afford to subsidize my brother's poor choices." "Has he ever been angry with you for saying no?" "Oh, absolutely. He's told me I'm selfish, that families should stick together, that I don't understand how hard things are for him. But Mom, I also watched what happened when you said yes to everything. It didn't make him more responsible, it made him less responsible." After our conversation, I realized that Maria had been implementing the boundaries I was only now beginning to consider. She'd faced the same guilt trips and manipulation tactics from Daniel, but she'd held firm because she understood something I was just learning. Saying yes to everything wasn't actually helping him. That afternoon, I did something else I'd never done before. I researched Daniel's actual living expenses. I looked up average rent for apartments in his area, calculated the cost of basic utilities and groceries, researched car payment ranges for vehicles appropriate to his income level. What I found was illuminating. A responsible budget based on his actual salary would have required him to live in a smaller apartment, drive a less expensive car, and significantly reduce his entertainment spending. But it was absolutely doable. Thousands of people in Riverside County lived comfortably on salaries similar to Daniel's. They just lived within their means. The difference was that those people didn't have mothers willing to fund the gap between their income and their desired lifestyle. I spent the next few days ignoring Daniel's increasingly frantic calls and text messages. Each message followed the same pattern. Apology for his tone, reassurance that he was truly grateful for all my help, and urgent reminders about his looming deadlines. When emotional appeals didn't work, he tried practical arguments. When those failed, he tried guilt. "Mom, Rebecca is crying because she's scared we're going to be homeless. Is this really what you want?" "I just need to get through this rough patch, and then I'll never ask for help again, I promise." Dad would have helped me. Dad understood what family means. That last message, invoking Marcus's memory to manipulate me, was the final straw. Marcus, who had grown increasingly concerned about Daniel's financial dependence before he died. Marcus, who had started questioning whether our help was actually hurting our son. Marcus, who would have been appalled to see his memory weaponized in service of emotional blackmail. I turned off my phone again and sat down to write a letter. Not an email or a text that could be quickly deleted or ignored, but a physical letter on my good stationery that would require Daniel to sit down and really read what I had to say. The letter took me 3 drafts to get right. I wanted to be firm but not cruel, clear but not harsh. I wanted Daniel to understand that this wasn't about punishment or lack of love. It was about love so deep that I was willing to endure his anger in order to help him become the man I knew he could be. When I finished, I sealed it in an envelope and put it on the kitchen counter where it would wait until I was ready to deliver it. Tomorrow, I would have the conversation that would change everything between us. Tonight, I would prepare for the hardest thing I'd ever had to do as a mother. Refuse to rescue my child from the consequences of his own choices. I called Daniel on December 28th, exactly 3 days after our Christmas confrontation. My hands were steadier than I'd expected as I dialed his number, the letter I'd written sitting open on the kitchen table in front of me like a script for the most important performance of my life. "Mom, thank God," he answered on the first ring, his voice flooding with relief. "I've been trying to reach you for days. Listen, I know you're upset about Christmas, but we really need to talk about—" "Daniel," I interrupted gently but firmly. "I'm calling because I want to meet with you today. But we're not going to talk about money." "What do you mean we're not going to talk about money?" "Mom, it's December 28th. I have 3 days to—" "We're going to talk about our relationship. About boundaries. About what kind of support I'm willing to provide going forward and what kind I'm not." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally he spoke, and his voice had that careful, controlled quality that meant he was trying very hard not to lose his temper. "Okay," he said slowly. "When and where? Your apartment. I want to see how you're actually living." Another pause. The place is kind of a mess right now, and Daniel, I'm not coming to judge your housekeeping. I'm coming because it's time I understood the full scope of what I've been funding. He gave me the address with obvious reluctance, and I could hear Rebecca's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. Their conversation sounded tense, hurried, like people trying to decide how much to clean up before an unwelcome inspection. I arrived at Daniel's apartment complex at 2 in the afternoon, driving slowly through the maze of buildings until I found his unit. The complex was nice. Newer construction, well-maintained landscaping, a sparkling pool visible through the clubhouse windows. It was exactly the kind of place a young professional would want to live, and exactly the kind of place that cost more than a young professional could afford on a modest salary. Daniel met me at the door, and I could see immediately that he'd been preparing for my visit. His hair was freshly combed, he was wearing a button-down shirt instead of his usual t-shirt, and there was a nervous energy about him that reminded me of the way he used to act before parent-teacher conferences in high school. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let me enter. "Rebecca's at work, so it's just us." The apartment was beautiful. High ceilings, granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, a living room that opened onto a small balcony overlooking the pool. It was also far too expensive for someone making Daniel's salary, a fact that became even more obvious as I took in the furnishings. The couch was leather, the kind that cost several $1,000s new. The entertainment center held a massive flat-screen TV and what looked like an expensive sound system. The coffee table was solid wood, heavy and substantial. Even the artwork on the walls looked professionally framed. "This is lovely, Daniel," I said, and I meant it. "When did you buy all this furniture?" "Oh, gradually. Some of it's from when Rebecca and I moved in together, some I picked up along the way." I walked slowly through the space, noting details. The kitchen was stocked with high-end appliances, an expensive espresso machine, a stand mixer that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, a knife set that I recognized from an upscale cooking store. The refrigerator was covered with takeout menus from restaurants that charged $25 for an entree. "Daniel," I said, turning to face him in the living room, "help me understand something. You're telling me you can't afford your rent, but you're living in a place that costs at least $2,000 a month, furnished with items that probably cost more than most people make in several months." He shifted uncomfortably, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I got good deals on most of this stuff, and some of it was gifts." "Gifts from whom?" "Rebecca's parents helped out when we moved in. And I've been building up my stuff for years, It's not like I bought everything at once." I sat down on the expensive couch and gestured for him to join me. "Daniel, I want to show you something." I pulled out the financial accounting I'd prepared, the detailed list of every dollar I'd given him over the past decade. His face went pale as I read through the categories and amounts, the color draining from his cheeks as the total grew larger and larger. $81,500, I said when I reached the end. "That's what I've given you over the past 10 years, not counting the everyday expenses I covered when you were living at home." "Mom, I didn't realize it was that much." "I don't think you've realized a lot of things, Daniel, like the fact that this amount of money represents more than half of my annual income. Or that continuing to support you at this level could jeopardize my ability to maintain my own home and independence as I age." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the paper in my hands as if the numbers might change if he looked at them hard enough. "I know I owe you money," he said finally. "And I fully intend to pay you back. That's why I need this $5,000, to get stable so I can start making payments." "Daniel, stop. Please just stop with the fantasy that this is all going to work out if I just give you a little more money. Look around this apartment, look at your lifestyle. You're living like someone who makes twice what you actually earn, and you're funding that lifestyle with money from me. That's not fair. I work hard, and I deserve to have nice things." Everyone deserves nice things, Daniel. But most people understand that you have to earn them first, not borrow them, and hope everything works out later. I stood up and walked to the sliding door that led to the balcony, looking out at the pool where a few residents were enjoying the afternoon sun, despite the December chill. "This is a beautiful place to live," I said. "It's also a place for someone who makes $50,000 more per year than you do." "So what are you saying? That I should live in some crappy studio apartment because I don't make enough money?" "I'm saying you should live in a place you can afford, drive a car you can afford, and buy furniture you can afford. Like every other responsible adult in the world." Daniel's face was flushed now, and I could see his anger building. "So you're not going to help me?" "I'm going to help you, Daniel, just not in the way you want." I sat back down and pulled out the letter I'd written, unfolding it carefully. "I'm going to read you something I wrote, and I want you to listen to every word." "Mom, I don't need a lecture. I need $5,000. "No, Daniel, you need to hear this." I began to read. "My dear son, I love you more than you will ever understand. I loved you when you took your first steps, when you graduated from high school, when you started your first job, and I love you now. But love doesn't mean giving someone everything they ask for, especially when what they're asking for is harmful to both of us." Daniel tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand and continued. "I have enabled your financial irresponsibility for 10 years, and in doing so, I have robbed you of the opportunity to develop the skills and confidence that come from solving your own problems. I have made it so easy for you to avoid consequences that you've never learned to make good choices. That ends today." "Mom, please." "I will no longer provide money for rent, car payments, credit card bills, or any other basic living expenses. I will no longer serve as your backup plan when your spending exceeds your income. I will no longer accept responsibility for financial crises that result from your choices." The apartment was dead silent except for the sound of my own voice reading the words I'd crafted so carefully. "Instead, I will support you in ways that help you build independence rather than dependence. I will pay for courses or training that could improve your earning potential. I will help with genuine emergencies, medical bills, major car repairs that are necessary for you to keep working. I will provide guidance and advice when you ask for it. But I will not fund a lifestyle you cannot afford." I looked up from the letter to find Daniel staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but genuine shock, as if I'd revealed myself to be a completely different person than the mother he thought he knew. "You can't be serious," he said quietly. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life. So you're just gonna let me lose my apartment? Let me lose my car? Let Rebecca and me end up on the street?" "Daniel, listen to what you're saying. You're acting like I'm the one making these things happen. I'm not taking your apartment away from you. You took it away from yourself when you chose to rent a place you couldn't afford. I'm not repossessing your car. You did that when you signed up for payments that exceeded your budget." He stood up abruptly, beginning to pace around the living room like a caged animal. "This is unbelievable. This is actually unbelievable. Your own son is asking for help, and you're going to turn your back on him." "I'm not turning my back on you. I'm finally turning toward you, the real you, not the financial dependent I've been creating for the past decade." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I want to know who Daniel Smith really is when he doesn't have his mother's checkbook as a safety net. I want to see what you're capable of when you have to rely on your own creativity and resourcefulness instead of my money." Daniel stopped pacing and turned to face me, his face twisted with an anger I'd never seen directed at me before. "You want to know who I really am?" he said, his voice rising. "I'm your son who's drowning, and you're standing on the shore with a life preserver, choosing not to throw it." "No, Daniel," I said, standing up and folding the letter carefully. "You're a grown man who jumped into water that was too deep for him, and I'm finally refusing to swim out and carry you back to shore every time you get tired." I walked toward the door, my heart pounding but my resolve stronger than ever. "Mom, wait," he called after me, desperation creeping into his voice. "What am I supposed to do?" I turned back to him one last time. "You're supposed to figure it out, Daniel. That's what adults do." The days following my ultimatum to Daniel were eerily quiet. My phone, which had buzzed constantly with his urgent messages for weeks, fell silent. No desperate texts, no frantic voicemails, No emotional manipulation disguised as apologies. The silence was both a relief and a source of anxiety. Relief that I wasn't constantly being pressured for money. Anxiety about what Daniel might be doing in response to my refusal to rescue him. On New Year's Eve, exactly one day after his self-imposed deadline for the $5,000, I got my answer. I was preparing a quiet dinner for myself, planning to ring in the new year with a book and a cup of tea, when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Rebecca standing on my front porch, looking nervous and exhausted. She was alone. "Mrs. Smith," she said when I opened the door. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I really need to talk to you. It's about Daniel." I invited her in, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly as she accepted my offer of coffee. She looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in days. "Is Daniel okay?" I asked, settling into my living room chair across from where she perched nervously on the edge of the couch. Well, physically he's fine. But Mrs. Smith, I think you should know what's been happening since your conversation at the apartment." What Rebecca told me over the next hour was both shocking and, in retrospect, entirely predictable. After I'd left his apartment, Daniel had spent the rest of the day calling everyone he could think of who might lend him money. He'd contacted his college friends, distant relatives, even former coworkers from jobs he'd held years ago. Most had politely declined or simply not returned his calls. A few had been more direct about their reasons for saying no. His cousin Jake told him that everyone in the family knows he never pays back loans, Rebecca said, cupping her coffee mug between her hands for warmth. His friend Mike from college said Daniel still owed him $300 from 2 years ago. One of his former bosses actually laughed and hung up on him. The picture Rebecca painted was of a man whose financial irresponsibility was well known among everyone who knew him. Everyone except me, apparently. While I'd been quietly enabling his lifestyle, Daniel had burned through most of his other potential sources of support. "But Mrs. Smith, that's not the worst part," Rebecca continued, her voice growing smaller. "When Daniel couldn't find anyone to loan him the money, he did something really stupid." My stomach clenched with apprehension. What did he do? He took a cash advance from one of those payday loan places, the kind with the terrible interest rates and the 2-week payback periods. The blood drained from my face. How much? $3,000. He figured if he could at least pay part of the rent, maybe the landlord would give him more time for the rest. Payday loans were financial death traps, designed to keep people in cycles of debt that became nearly impossible to escape. The interest rates were astronomical, often exceeding 400% annually. Taking a $3,000 advance meant Daniel would owe significantly more than that in just 2 weeks. "Rebecca, please tell me he didn't actually do this." "He did. And Mrs. Smith, it gets worse." When the landlord wouldn't accept a partial payment, Daniel panicked. He went to another payday loan place and took out another advance to cover the rest of the rent. How much more? $2,000. And then he needed money for the car payment, so he went to a third place. I felt sick. "Rebecca, how much debt has he taken on in the past week?" $8,000, she whispered. $8,000 that has to be paid back within 2 weeks, or the interest compounds, and the amounts double. I sat back in my chair, stunned by the magnitude of Daniel's self-destruction. In less than a week, rather than face the consequences of his lifestyle choices, he had trapped himself in a cycle of predatory debt that would be infinitely worse than anything he'd been facing before. "And there's something else," Rebecca said, tears starting to form in her eyes. "He told me this was all your fault. He said if you had just helped him like you always do, none of this would have happened. He's convinced that you're responsible for this mess because you abandoned him when he needed you most." The irony was breathtaking. Instead of recognizing that his financial crisis stemmed from his own poor choices, Daniel had doubled down on those same poor choices and then blamed me for the consequences. "Rebecca, I have to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Did you know how much money I've been giving Daniel over the years?" She shook her head slowly. "I knew you helped him sometimes, but he always made it sound like small amounts. Emergency car repairs, help with a security deposit, things like that. He never told me about the photography equipment, or the food truck, or any of the big stuff. Did you know he owed me over $80,000? Her coffee mug slipped from her hands, landing on the carpet with a soft thud. 80,000? Mrs. Smith, that's more than I make in 2 years. Did you know that even with his current job, he's been asking me for money almost every month? No, he told me he was managing fine on his salary. When bills were tight, he said he was just being careful with spending until the next paycheck came in. I could see the realization dawning on Rebecca's face as she began to understand the true scope of Daniel's deception. He hadn't just been lying to me about his financial stability. He'd been lying to her as well. Rebecca, why are you telling me all this? She was quiet for a long moment, wiping tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. Because I love him, Mrs. Smith. But I also love myself enough to know that I can't stay with someone who lies to me about something this important. And because I think you were right to say no. What do you mean? I've been thinking about it all week, ever since Christmas. Daniel is 28 years old, and he has no idea how to budget, how to live within his means, how to handle money responsibly. Every time he gets into trouble, his first thought isn't, how can I fix this? It's who can I call to fix this for me? Rebecca stood up and began pacing around my living room, her nervous energy evident in every step. When I started dating him, I thought he was financially stable because he always had money for nice dinners and weekend trips. It never occurred to me that he was funding that lifestyle with money from his mother. And when we moved in together, I thought we were being responsible adults, but really, I was just the latest person to subsidize his inability to live like a grown-up. What are you going to do? I'm moving out. I've already found a studio apartment that I can afford on my nursing salary. It's small and it's not in the nicest area, but it's mine, and I can pay for it myself. The courage in her voice, the determination to take responsibility for her own life even when it meant making difficult sacrifices, was everything I'd hoped to teach Daniel but had apparently failed to instill. And Daniel? Daniel is going to have to figure out how to dig himself out of this hole. The payday loans are due in 10 days, and he's already talking about taking out more advances to pay them back. He wants me to ask my parents for money, or to put the debt on credit cards in my name since his are maxed out. Will you? Absolutely not. Mrs. Smith, watching what's happened this week has been like seeing into the future. This is who Daniel is, when he can't rely on other people's money. He panics, he makes terrible decisions, and then he blames everyone except himself for the consequences. I walked Rebecca to the door, feeling a strange mixture of sadness for Daniel and respect for the young woman who had the wisdom to recognize a destructive pattern and the strength to remove herself from it. Rebecca, I said as she was putting on her coat, can I ask you one more thing? Do you think there's any chance this crisis will teach Daniel to change his behavior? She was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Honestly? I don't think so. I think he'll find a way to blame this on you, or on me for leaving, or on the payday loan companies for having predatory practices. I think he'll eventually find someone else to rescue him. Maybe a new girlfriend, maybe a sympathetic coworker. But I don't think he'll ever look in the mirror and recognize that he's the common denominator in all of his financial crises. After Rebecca left, I sat alone in my living room as the clock ticked toward midnight, processing everything she'd told me. Daniel had taken my refusal to enable him and used it as justification for making even worse choices. Instead of learning to live within his means, he'd trapped himself in a cycle of predatory debt that could take years to escape. Part of me, the maternal part that had always rushed to his rescue, wanted to call him immediately and offer to pay off the payday loans. $8,000 was manageable for me, and watching my son destroy his financial future with compound interest felt unbearably cruel. But the wiser part of me, the part that had finally learned to distinguish between helping and enabling, recognized that rescuing Daniel from this crisis would only teach him that there were no consequences too severe for someone else to fix. If Rebecca was right, if Daniel was determined to blame everyone except himself for his choices, then no amount of money from me would ever be enough to solve his fundamental problem. As the clock struck midnight and fireworks began exploding somewhere in the distance, I made a resolution that had nothing to do with diet or exercise or self-improvement. I resolved to love my son enough to let him learn from his mistakes, no matter how painful it was to watch. 3 months later, I was tending to my garden on a crisp March morning when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Daniel's number, the first time he'd contacted me since New Year's Eve. My hands were dirty from planting new rose bushes, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. "Hello, Daniel." "Hi, Mom." His voice was different. Quieter, less demanding than I remembered. "I was wondering if we could talk. In person, I mean." "What about?" "About everything. About what's happened. About where we go from here." I agreed to meet him at a small cafe downtown, neutral territory that wasn't loaded with the emotional history of either of our homes. When I arrived, I almost didn't recognize him. He'd lost weight, and not in a healthy way. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, and there was something hollow about his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant stress. "Thanks for coming," he said as I sat down across from him at a small table by the window. "How are you, Daniel?" He let out a bitter laugh. "I've been better, but I'm sure you know that already." I didn't respond, waiting for him to continue. "The payday loans destroyed me," he said bluntly. "I couldn't keep up with the payments, so I took out more loans to pay the first ones, and then more to pay those. Within 6 weeks, I owed almost $20,000. $20,000. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I felt the familiar maternal panic, the instinct to ask how I could help, how much money he needed to fix this latest crisis. "What did you do?" "I had to declare bankruptcy. Lost the apartment, lost the car, lost pretty much everything except the clothes on my back and whatever I could fit in a duffel bag." He paused, stirring his coffee with a mechanical motion that suggested the action was more about having something to do with his hands than any interest in the drink itself. "I've been staying at a homeless shelter for the past month. Working part-time at a warehouse loading trucks for minimum wage, trying to save enough money for a security deposit on a room somewhere." The words hit me like physical blows. My son, my child, sleeping in a homeless shelter, working a minimum wage job, living out of a duffel bag. Every maternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to fix this, to write a check, to bring him home and make everything better. But I stayed silent. "I know what you're thinking," Daniel continued. "You're thinking this is exactly what I deserve for not listening to you, for making stupid choices, for getting myself into this mess." "Actually," I said carefully, "I was thinking about how sorry I am that you're going through this." His eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him in years that wasn't anger or manipulation. "Mom, I need you to know something. I spent weeks being furious with you. I told everyone who would listen that my own mother had abandoned me when I needed her most. I blamed you for the payday loans, for losing the apartment, for Rebecca leaving me. I convinced myself that this was all your fault. And now? Now I know better. The counselor at the shelter, she runs these financial literacy classes, and she made me track every dollar I'd spent over the past year. Made me look at my choices, really look at them." Daniel reached into his worn jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, smoothing it out on the table between us. "This is what I spent money on instead of saving for emergencies or living within my means," he said. $300 a month on restaurant meals when I could have cooked at home, $200 on entertainment, movies, bars, concerts, $150 on clothes I didn't need, $50 a month on premium subscription services I barely used. I looked at the list, recognizing the meticulous handwriting that reminded me of the careful way he used to complete homework assignments in elementary school. "That's $700 a month," he continued. "More than enough to have built an emergency fund. More than enough to have made my financial situation stable instead of constantly crisis-driven." "What made you realize this?" "The shelter," he said simply. "Living with people who had truly fallen through the cracks. People with mental illness, addiction, abuse histories. People who ended up homeless because of circumstances beyond their control. And there I was, a college-educated guy with a working family, who'd ended up in the same place because I was too entitled and irresponsible to live like an adult." He took a shaky breath before continuing. "There's this guy there, Marcus. Same name as Dad, actually. He's 73 years old, worked construction his whole life, until a back injury forced him to retire. His pension wasn't enough to cover rent increases, and he ended up losing his apartment. He should be the angry one, you know? Life actually screwed him over. But he's not angry. He's the most positive person I've ever met. Gets up every morning, helps in the kitchen, volunteers to read to kids at the library, and when I was ranting about how unfair my situation was, he just looked at me and said, "Son, the only unfair thing about your situation is that you had advantages most people would kill for, and you threw them away." Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and I could see the little boy he used to be underneath the hollow-eyed young man sitting across from me. He was right, Mom. I had a mother who loved me enough to support me for 10 years. I had opportunities, education, chances to build something real, and I wasted all of it because I thought I deserved an easy life without having to work for it. For the first time in our conversation, I reached across the table and touched his hand. "Daniel, what are you asking of me? What do you want from this conversation?" "I want to apologize. Really apologize, not the fake apologies I used to give when I wanted something from you. I'm sorry for taking advantage of your love. I'm sorry for calling you selfish when you were actually trying to help me grow up. I'm sorry for wasting $80,000 of your money on a lifestyle I hadn't earned." He paused, looking directly into my eyes for the first time since Christmas. "And I want you to know that I'm not asking you for money. I'm not asking you to let me move back home. I'm not asking you to rescue me from this situation." "What are you asking for?" "I'm asking if there's a chance we can rebuild our relationship on different terms. Terms where I take responsibility for my own life, and you can be my mother instead of my bank account." I sat back in my chair, studying his face for any sign of manipulation or hidden agenda. What I saw instead was something I hadn't seen from Daniel in years: genuine humility. "The counselor at the shelter helped me understand something," he continued. "She said that every time you bailed me out, you were actually showing me love, but I was learning dependence. And every time I asked for help, I thought I was just getting support, but I was actually giving away pieces of my self-respect. What does rebuilding look like to you? It looks like me figuring out how to get back on my feet without your money. It looks like me calling you to ask for advice instead of cash. It looks like me taking responsibility for my choices and their consequences, even when those consequences are really hard to live with." I thought about Marcus, my husband, and how proud he would have been to hear Daniel speak these words. How many nights had we talked about wanting our children to be independent, self-sufficient, capable of handling life's challenges on their own? "Daniel, I need you to understand something. If we rebuild our relationship, it has to be based on who you actually are, not who I want you to be or who you promise to become. It has to be based on your actions over time, not just your words today. I understand that. I know I have to earn back your trust. And I need you to understand that my saying no to financial requests isn't punishment or lack of love. It's recognition that the most loving thing I can do is let you develop the skills and confidence that come from solving your own problems." I'm starting to understand that too. We talked for another hour, and for the first time in years, it felt like a conversation between adults rather than a negotiation between an enabler and a dependent. Daniel told me about his plans to complete his GED equivalent, about apprenticeship programs at the warehouse that could lead to better paying positions, about the slow process of rebuilding his credit and his life. When we parted ways in the parking lot, he hugged me. A real hug, not the perfunctory embraces I'd grown accustomed to. "Mom," he said as we separated, "I know I can't undo the past 10 years, but I want you to know that everything you did for me, even when I didn't appreciate it, came from love. And everything you're not doing for me now comes from love, too." 6 months later, Daniel called to tell me he'd been promoted to a supervisory position at the warehouse. He'd found a small studio apartment he could afford on his salary, and he'd started taking community college classes in the evenings. We had dinner together once a month, conversations that focused on his goals, his challenges, and his gradual progress toward genuine independence. He never asked me for money. The hardest lesson I learned through this entire experience was that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to make their life easier. That watching someone you love struggle with the consequences of their choices, even when you have the power to remove those consequences, requires a different kind of courage than writing a check. Daniel's crisis wasn't caused by my refusal to give him $5,000 on Christmas morning. It was caused by 28 years of choices, His choices to live beyond his means, and my choices to enable that lifestyle. The only difference was that when I finally stopped making my choice, he was forced to confront his. Today I have a son who takes pride in paying his own bills, who calls to share his successes rather than his crises, who has learned that self-respect comes from self-reliance. It took losing everything for him to find himself, but sometimes that's what love looks like, not a safety net, but the courage to let someone learn to fly on their own. The burden he once thought I carried wasn't mine to bear after all. It was his, and teaching him to carry it himself was the greatest gift I could give him. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.